Hello and good day. So it's been a while since I've made an update to this video, and so I thought it's about time that I went through what the strongest dragons in DML are. So to some of us this is probably going to be pretty obvious because we have dragons such as Enroja, which are the divine ancient exception dragons in DML, and it is basically just these dragons that are the strongest dragons in DML by far, which is very different from the video that I made way back in 2018 talking about the 5 strongest dragons, where the old strongest ones used to be Freya and Hathor, and we have come a very long way since then, and we can't even include legendaries in the lists anymore. But in terms of the strongest dragons here, technically speaking, there is no singular strongest dragon in DML because it's mainly about how good your complete team is together so that you can do well in the dungeon, you can do well in maps, things like that. But there are specific dragons that are just much better than the others in terms of their actual stats. So I'm actually going to use one of the highest rated DCP people in EURPC to showcase which dragons are actually the strongest out of the selection of Ancients and Divines. First one, which is arguably technically one of the strongest in the game, is the Lysk dragon, mainly because they have that ancient light, they've got the high stats, and they have light. And light is a really powerful element, although light isn't quite as useful as fire in the dungeon. So although I would consider Lysk stronger than Oyar, I think Oyar is actually better for dungeon grinding. So Oyar is still an amazing dragon overall with that fire AoE attack, but he is better for doing weak attack quests. But for pure damage that isn't resisted by a lot, Lysk is probably, arguably, the best dragon in the game. One of the best supporters in the game is the ancient Baha'jir dragon, because Baha'jir is an ancient, divine, and water dragon, and we all need a really good healer, and Baha'jir has the ancient, divine, the base stats, and the healing that we need. Baha'jir is an insanely good team member, and to top it off, along with that, another fantastic team member is Enroja, because that is going to be one massive earth shield. So that's why Enroja, Baha'jir, and Lysk/Oyar are technically one of the strongest dragon teams in the entire game. The only thing to remember is that there is also the other dragon that we could have, which is Kothez. But rather than Kothez being an AoE damage dealer, Kothez has that really strong metal element. The only problem is, metal isn't always the best for grinding out the tasks in dungeon, but it's really useful for getting KOs in the dungeon. So if you had a 6 dragon team and had Kothez on the second team, he could be really good for just pounding out some extra KOs onto an opponent. But overall, those are the best ancients in the game right now. Of course, not everyone's going to have access to them because they were the major event reward dragons, and so you might end up having to use dragons like I do, like Ikez, which still has pretty good stats, but nowhere near close to what those other dragons have. But the major problem with having team members that only have a limited amount of elements, like say if you put together, for example, this would be an example of a dungeon team with Oyar, Enroja, and Baha'jir, you're going to have an absolutely insane set of stats. The problem is, with these dragons, you have barely any elements on the team. So even if you had the strongest dragon team in the game, you're probably going to get screwed over during castle events, you're probably not going to do too well against double trouble battles, things like that, because you have such a limited amount of elements to use. So there are massive pros to using such a strong team in, say, the dungeon, but there's also some major drawbacks if you only have them as your main 3. So that makes it difficult to actually pick out a team when the best teams technically would have a massive weakness in one way or another. But obviously, if you have these 3 dragons as your mains, it's probably best for you to have 6 dragons, so that you can have one team and a second team with just the elements that you need for coverage, sort of thing. But I guess the easiest way for me to illustrate just how much of a difference these Ancient Divine Dragon exceptions are compared to the old Powerhouse Dragons is using this section here, which is in the Sigil section of DML Planner. You'll see Sumo at level 120, enchantment level 12, has 17 trillion base, 50.9 trillion health, and then Hathor is 9% better than Sumo in terms of the base attack, and plus 19% compared to his base health, and then Glom had even more, with plus 2% on Hathor's attack, and plus 1% compared to his health. However, this doesn't even take into account the sigils, and the way that the sigils are going to actually, I guess, work on these dragons, because I could set the sigils right now. And so including sigils, you'll see just how much of a difference it makes to Glom's base stats. His health goes up to 500 trillion, and his attack goes up to 76 trillion with epic acceptance witchcraft. And again, that doesn't even take into account what these sigils will actually do when the dragon actually uses them and when they're synergizing, which is kind of insane. And so if I do the same for Mr. Hathor here, we'll put Wonder Acceptance on Hathor, because Hathor has the Bless that we'd need to use. He doesn't make use out of Witchcraft very much. And so then you'll see that it says that Glom's base health is lower than Hathor's, but again, with the way that the sigils interact, and plus Glom's got that Divine plus Ancient, it makes a massive difference. And then we could also put some epic sigils on Mr. Sumo, which he'd probably have acceptance and probably witchcraft, or he could have havoc if you really needed the AoE. I'm going to put witchcraft just to make sure that we're using similar sigils here. But it says that he has more base attack. But again, that's not actually true, because when Hathor blesses, that's going to make him worlds apart from Mr. Sumo Dragon. These are just, when you add the sigil, the difference it makes to their base stats. It doesn't include actually all the interactions with what sigils do, and the blessing, and everything else, which we could calculate, but it goes into some crazy numbers. Many trillions. Many trillions. But Mr. Sumo, unfortunately, as he does not have the ability to use Wonder Acceptance with Bless or with Ancient, it just makes him infinitely worse than the other 2 options. And that's the reason why we don't recommend players to use legendaries anymore, because they just do not compare to the other powerhouse dragons that we have. So, if we go back to our team planner with these best dragons, once again, you could probably pick out any of these major exception dragons and use them on your team, but one thing that you have to be very, very aware of when you're using these dragons, when you're trying to use them in the dungeon, is the fact that the dungeon will scale based on your dragon's stats, and that does include the sigils that they're using. So the problem becomes, if you only have, say, one major exception dragon, like only Enroja, and maybe Freya plus another dragon, the dungeon's going to be scaled based off of Enroja's stats, which of course, if we set him to level 120, 12, that's going to be 18.93 trillion attack and 61 trillion health, and then add the sigils on top, whether they be rare or epic, it's going to be scaled based on him. So, you need to try and make sure that your team is strong enough to be able to keep up with Enroja, and sometimes it's actually advised to keep some of your other team members, say if you've only got one major exception dragon and you've got 2 non-exceptions. In some cases, it's actually beneficial to give the non-exceptions a couple of levels extra. But it's the sort of thing where you'd have to go through with your own team, mess around, check the stats, because, again, You gotta remember that the dungeon now scales based off of your highest dragon ever in-game, which means that if you ever had a dragon that was like level 90 and you sold it, your dungeon would still be scaled to level 90s. And if you have an Enroja that is level 70, and your other dragons are, say, level 72, in some cases that may actually be better. But I think for anyone that is at that point where they're trying to put in a dragon such as Enroja, plus like Homala, that would be an example of a team. These two are sitting in the same habitat, so it just came to mind, and, you know, it could actually work as a team, like these two together. If you were going to do that, then it might be worth you messing around in the dungeon quite a bit and seeing if, say, you added a couple of levels extra to Homala, if it makes the dungeon balance out a little bit better for you. But it all comes down to those base stats, plus the wonders and witchcrafts added on top. So it does depend on your sigil rarity, and it does depend on the base stats of the dragon itself. So keep all of that in mind when you are making a dungeon team, but be aware that all of these dragons at the bottom of this list are the strongest dragons in the game, but the ones that are the most useful are going to be that Enroja, Baha'jir, Oyar, Lysk, and probably Kothez. So those are the strongest dragons in DML. Let me know what you think compared to some of their old compatriots. If you're going to ask me what the best epics in there are, it literally doesn't matter anymore. None of them are even close to as good as any of these. So it doesn't actually really matter as much, as long as you have a strong Bless and a strong Leech. It's mainly because of how unbalanced Wonder Acceptance is at the moment, because of the synergy between the sigils. But of course the problem with that is that you have to actually get the sigils for those dragons as well, so you need to get enough Wonders and enough Acceptances to actually make your team balanced. Otherwise, you're gonna have a very bad time in the dungeon. But anyway, I thought I'd go through this pretty quickly today. Good luck with making your teams. Some of us are just stuck with a dragon team for now until we can finally get the resources up for the team that we truly want. And again, if you ever want to know how much or how many resources overall it's going to cost you, you can actually check in Team Planner. Because for instance, if you put in these 3 dragons here, it shows me that I'm going to need 1.49 billion food to get Oyar, Enroja, and Baha'jir together in a team. That's a lot of food. 1.49 billion food! Jesus! That is gonna be a lot of feeding. But anyway, I appreciate you being here, and until next time, I hope to see you then.